Golden rule number one is make sure you're invested in the right risk profile for your circumstances. Be aware of what your employer contributions are and what maximum they will go up to. And if you get bonuses and things like that and you don't need the money now, great, you can put bonuses into your pension.
Hello and welcome to the Steps to Investing podcast, to our listeners and of course our viewers on YouTube. Today we're going to go back into that big subject that is pensions, probably the most important financial goal that you will ever set yourself. And we're going to look at a few things today. We're going to have a look at what it is that you're trying to achieve, so the different lifestyles and how much they cost, and then also how inflation might be affecting those. We're also going to get some tips for boosting your pensions. And then we're going to finish off looking a little bit further forward, thinking about what Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, might be announcing in this spring statement. So to help us explore these topics, I've got with me the Director of Public Affairs at PensionBee, a platform that we're very much a fan of on the Steps to Investing podcast, doing great things for pension saving. So I'd like to welcome Becky O'Connor. Becky, welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're quite new to PensionBee, aren't you?
Yes, I started at the beginning of January. I'm new to PensionBee, but not the topic of pensions, luckily. So I'm very happy to be here, and it's a company I've long admired.
Been going, absolutely growing at great guns. We were sort of having a little chat about this before, sort of absolutely exploded in recent years, hasn't it?
Yeah, so it was first founded in 2014. It's obviously really taken off, listed, and fantastic brand awareness. I think lots of people have seen the ads on around the tube, and now sponsoring Brentford Football Club. So yeah, I think in terms of brand awareness, it's done particularly well.
And in case you're just so our listeners are aware, just as a little reminder, it's focused around, as you can probably imagine, the goal of pension savings as well. And it's what we would call a robo-advisor or digital wealth manager. There's lots of different names for these sorts of platforms, but they're like a new breed of platforms where it's simplifying things. It's around just sort of identifying some levels of risk or what you're trying to achieve, and then putting you into some big, broad, diversified portfolios. So let's get on to painting a bit of a picture around retirement, Becky. So what is it that the state? I was just going to start. We've got different sort of pension options. We've got the state pension that we receive from national insurance contributions, and then we can save towards our own private pensions as well. So I'm just wondering, what is it that the state provides, and is there much of a gap between what this is and sort of a decent level of living when you're in retirement?
I think most of us expect that we'll receive some state pension, but it's difficult to know how much state pension we're going to get, because obviously it will be different in my case in like 25 years time to what it is now, because it rises over time with inflation, and also earnings, or 2.5%. There's this thing called the state pension triple lock guarantee, which you may have read about, because it's quite controversial, because it guarantees that the state pension goes up. And obviously the government is seeking revenue at the moment, and things like the triple lock guarantee are quite expensive guarantees. But nevertheless, let's assume that the triple lock or some form of increase continues. At the moment, the full new state pension is worth just over £9,600 a year in income, and you get that from age 66 currently. That age is on the rise to 67, and again it's under review, and we'll talk about this later on, to 68. So most people depend on the state pension to retire. So although we have workplace pensions and private pensions and ways that we can build up our own long-term savings, in most cases that won't be enough for people to retire on. They need the state pension plus their workplace pension to have enough for basic or even slightly more than basic standard of living and retirement, depending on what you want and can achieve. So when I said the full new state pension quite deliberately, that's because there is also the old basic state pension, which was replaced by the new state pension in 2016. And it was overall less generous. So people who are, even if they had the full number of qualifying years on the basic state pension, they get less than people who have retired on the new state pension. So the pension system was all changed and shaken up in 2016. Things like the entitlement age for women went up from 60 to 65. Obviously, that was very controversial and provoked a huge backlash. That was another big change that happened then. But also, you might not get the full state pension, either the basic old version or the new version, because you might not have worked enough qualifying years. And now the number of qualifying years you need, and qualifying years means you have to have worked a certain amount and earned a certain amount in a year, and then it becomes a qualifying year. And you can find out all about this on the government website if you really want to go into detail. But you need 35 qualifying years. And if you have less than that, but you have more than 10 qualifying years, you will get some state pension. And it's also worth bearing in mind that you don't necessarily have to have worked to get those qualifying years. You might be entitled to national insurance credits because you took time out of work to care, which is something of social value. So therefore, you still get national insurance credits towards your state pension if the reason you didn't work were specific reasons. So childcare is one, and you can get, whether you're a grandparent or a parent, incidentally, you can get national insurance credit towards your state pension for doing those things. So that is worth knowing if you are somebody who's taken time out or is taking time out. So rewind. So the full new state pension currently pays just over 9,600 a year. However, most pensioners, existing pensioners, receive a fair bit less than this, either because they're on the basic state pension or they didn't quite get the full number of qualifying years that they needed for the full amount. So we can't assume that all pensioners are receiving that from the state pension. And going forward, we can't assume that everybody will get. So when you see these headline figures of, state pension to rise to more than 10,000 a year for the first time ever, it's just worth bearing in mind that, that's like the maximum that people will be getting in the state pension system.
Okay, so, but, if we were to say a full state pension, it's around £9,000. I suppose that's not a lot to live on every year. And there have been there's a very interesting organisation, Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association, that actually has a look at how much different lifestyles cost you. Am I right there?
Yeah. And of course, because of the cost of living crisis and inflation, the amount that you need for different living standards in retirement has gone up, and it's gone up by quite a bit more than the basic state pension or the new state pension. So the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association thinks, and by the way, they haven't done this research on their own. They've also done it in collaboration with the university, and they've worked out, what roughly a minimum living standard is, a moderate living standard, and a comfortable living standard, and what you can get for different amounts. So for a minimum living standard for a single person, they say that you need around £12,800 a year. So that obviously gives you a shortfall if you're just relying on the state pension of £2,200 a year, assuming you've got the full new state pension. Obviously, the shortfall will be even more than that if you're on the basic state pension, don't have enough qualifying years. So that's something that you would need if you wanted a minimum lifestyle, which they say covers all your needs with some left over for fun. And what that means is you could holiday in the UK once, eat out about once a month. Doesn't say where, doesn't say if it's McDonald's or Michelin-starred restaurant. I've got a feeling it's more the McDonald's end. And do some affordable leisure activities. Again, not sure what that is, but probably going to the leisure centre, isn't it? about twice a week. So they say that 3/4 of employees are likely to achieve at least the minimum living standard. So they're saying that 3/4 of people will also have enough from their workplace pensions over the years to top up whatever they get from state pension to meet this standard. For a couple, by the way, the minimum needed is 19,900. So divided by 2, that's like an extra, that's 10,000 each. So then that, is less of a shortfall. If both members of a couple were receiving a full new state pension, the shortfall there is about £400 a year each. So more manageable if you're a couple because of economies of scale, obviously. You're heating one home for two, whereas if you're single, you have higher costs. When it comes to a moderate living standard, which is something, so we bear in mind that 3/4 of employees are likely to achieve at least the minimum. The PLSA says that half of employees can expect somewhere between minimum and moderate. So not quite reaching the full moderate scale. But this is where you have a bit more security and flexibility, 1 foreign holiday a year, eat out a few times a month, and the opportunity to do more of the things you want to do, like socializing and so on. So that feels like more of a goal. And the amount that you would need as a single person for that is 23,300 a year. Couple, 34,000. Moving on to comfortable, and then we can talk a bit about how much extra you need in a private pension pot, workplace, or that you've built up yourself on top to generate these different amounts of income, because I think that's helpful. Because what we know is the pot size we've got, isn't it? Not how that translates into income necessarily. So for a comfortable standard of living, which is, I love this, it includes a subscription to a streaming service and regular beauty treatments. Again, doesn't say what beauty treatments, they can vary obviously. But
what streaming service either.
Oh, yeah, I know. I mean, for me, I'd want probably Netflix and Disney Plus, but 2 foreign holidays a year. So for a single person, the comfortable income is 37,300. And for a couple, it's 54,500. And bear in mind that this is in today's money. So, if you're 20 years off retirement, you kind of need to aim for this amount plus whatever inflation is going to require you to have over the next 20 years. So, there are calculators online that you can use to model some of that. But this is, we can only deal in today's money. And when they put this out for the first time last year, obviously these amounts were much lower. So it's gone up significantly in a year. So the PLSA thinks that to get a comfortable level of income, which for a single person is 37,300, you'd be looking at a pot size of around £328,000. So that's sort of it can only be a rough estimate, because the crucial bit of information that none of us know is how long we're going to live for, which very depressingly, that is basically what determines whether or not your pot is going to last and give you the income that you think it will. So we know what averages are, and it depends if you're a man or a woman. Women tend to live a little bit longer than men, so sort of like 83, 84, men kind of 80 to 82 roughly. But again, it's changing over time, so you don't know. But you're looking at slightly less than 20 years maybe from when you get the state pension. So you would be kind of dividing up your pot by the number of years, but even that's not exact, because obviously there'll be some investment growth on the pot side. So all you can deal with is educated guesses when you're looking at whether or not you've got enough on top of the state pension from your workplace pension pots that you've built up over the years. But anyway, it's good to have a guide, isn't it? It's good to have something to go on. And I think this is what these figures give us.
I mean, I think, yeah, you're exactly right. This is a bit of a guide. It's a rough idea of what that goal might be. But it does become complex in retirement because, you know, if you expect to live a certain amount of time and you're sort of getting near that and, you know, you're still going, you're perfectly healthy and your pot's sort of getting smaller and smaller, then you might begin to become concerned that you're going to run out of money. So I suppose that's some of the complexities of drawdown. But you have other options as well, I suppose, because you could buy an annuity, which would provide you some guarantees. Presumably, that's quite a good thing to look at in conjunction with drawdown.
Yeah, you can absolutely do both. And there is some research that suggests it's actually quite good to do drawdown for the early part of your retirement and then switch to an annuity later on so that you have the security of income. Annuity rates have improved quite a lot as interest rates have risen. So whereas they weren't necessarily very attractive 2 years ago, they have started to look more attractive now. You can get a decent return on a pot. So that's something to bear in mind. Also, there is this theory that people spend less the older they are in retirement. So, you know, when you first retire, you know, you're in your late 60s, you've still got lots of energy, you still want to do loads of stuff, spend time with your kids, your grandkids. And then the theory goes that, you know, you basically want to do less as you get older and you potter around a bit more, don't go so far afield, don't go on such expensive holidays. The Institute for Fiscal Studies did a really interesting report last year, and it suggested that that's not necessarily true, and that although your spending changes as you get older, it doesn't necessarily fall. You just use your money for different things. So it may not be wise to assume that, you know, you can spend all your money really early on and then, you know, just have a very simple, basic life later on, and you'll be happy with that, because there'll be other things coming down the line potentially that would require you to spend money on them. It could be grandchildren's weddings, it could be, you know, care costs, there's lots of things it could be that you'll still need some budget for. So worth bearing in mind that I think that is a myth worth dispelling. And in terms of, you know, when is the right time to take out an annuity, I really don't think, unfortunately, there's a one size fits all with this, because it depends how much you have. It depends, you know, whether you want to leave an inheritance, whether or not that's a viable thing to do with your pension, because for some people it's possible, for others it isn't really. And if you are hoping to use some of your pension pot to leave as an inheritance, you may wish to leave that portion invested in a higher percentage of equities than the portion that you would be looking to use for income, because it has potentially longer to grow if it's being left to relatives. So there's quite a few different things to consider. And of course, you know, when it starts to become very subjective and you've got lots of different things going on, lots of different goals and considerations, then it's a good idea to try and speak to an advisor, because they can go through that in more detail. But yeah, just to give an idea of some of the things that can, you know, maybe blindside you a bit and throw off your plans later on.
If I can't afford an advisor, is there anything free that the government offer?
There is. There is a service called PensionWise, which now is something that you definitely should steer yourself towards if you are not steered towards by your pension provider, although you should be now. And that's an appointment with the PensionWise service where they go through in, you know, a decent level of detail what your options are based on the types of pensions that you have, because, you know, that's another thing to bear in mind. If you have old defined benefit workplace schemes, then the way you access them can sometimes be different to newer style defined contribution schemes. And with defined benefit schemes, they have different, sometimes more restrictive on what happens to them when you die. It might be that a spouse can benefit from them, but then you can't leave them some of them as inheritance, whereas with defined contribution, you can. There are different terms associated with different types of pension. So PensionWise appointments can help you understand what the different options are with the different types of pension. Some actually have, you know, earlier minimum access ages than others as well. You know, if you were a firefighter, for instance, so at any point in your career. Those appointments are really valuable, and they are free. So they're available to over 50s. They're not available to everybody. But that's a point where, you know, a point in life when, you know, you probably do want to start thinking about how much you're likely to have, because it becomes a lot more real then. You know, I can still dream at, you know, the age of just over 40 that I might still have £1 million in retirement. But by the time you get to 50 plus, you kind of, you know, you roughly know, bar any extreme movements in markets, what you're going to have.
Interesting. Okay. Just so, I mean, I think, you know, absolutely great service as well, pension wise. Just for those who are a little bit younger, like yourself, you know, in terms of boosting your pension pot, trying to get to that £1 million, have you got any tips?
Golden rule number one is make sure you're invested in the right risk profile for your circumstances. I think a lot of people early on in their careers make the mistake actually of, when they're given the options of which plan to go for within the workplace scheme, they choose cautious. You know, hopefully they'd stay in the default kind of medium risk option that is, you know, takes into account their age. But, you know, often people choose the cautious one because they think it's my pension. I don't want anything bad to happen to that. That's a really important pot of money. I'm a cautious person, therefore I'm going to choose a cautious option. Probably not the right thing to do if you're early on in your career, because what you want is a higher proportion of equities in your portfolio, even up to 100% equities, in fact, early on in your career, because then you've got more chance of investment growth, boosting whatever contributions you're able to make over the decades. And yes, risk means that there is more risk of loss too, but the point is, you know, the earlier you are in your career, the more years you have to kind of smooth out those rough patches in markets and overall make bigger gains. So don't just think about, you know, your own personal risk tolerance and appetite when you're faced with a decision about where to invest your pension. Do consider, you know, where you are in your saving journey, for want of a better word. And so that's number one. Clearly, be aware of what your employer contributions are and what maximum they will go up to. And if you are lucky enough to be in a super generous scheme where an employer puts in, you know, double what you put in up to a really great maximum, you know, like say you put in, you have the option of putting in up to 7% and your employer will put in up to 14%. That's amazing. And if you can do it, then take advantage of that. And, you know, actually, you don't have to stick with the minimum auto enrollment amount, I think is just the thing to bear in mind, because I think a lot of people do just because that's kind of the default. So you kind of assume that that's fine. It isn't, unfortunately. Yes, it's great to be automatically enrolled. It's brilliant to have pensions, but realistically, making the minimum for your whole working life, making the minimum contribution is probably not going to be enough to get you to the comfortable living standard that we were talking about before. It will get you to sort of closer to above the minimum, but not quite moderate, probably, given, you know, certain assumptions about investment growth and salary. If you earned an average salary throughout your career and investment growth was roughly what it has been over inflation for the last 3 decades, then you'd come up with something like 170 to 180,000, which we know probably isn't going to be enough. So put in more than the minimum, basically. And hopefully one day the government will increase the minimum for us and we'll all be playing in 12%. And that will help. But, you know, in the meantime, we have to do it for ourselves. So put more in. Understand, or take the time to understand what type of pension you're paying into and how tax is applied or tax relief is applied to your pension, because there are different arrangements that can leave you slightly better or worse off, or can mean that you can save more tax. Like salary sacrifice is fantastic. If you want to keep your tax bill down, because say you're approaching the higher rate income tax threshold, and you're in a salary sacrifice pension scheme at work, and we know that the government's frozen these thresholds, so more people are being dragged into paying higher rates of income tax. If you don't need that money now and you can afford to defer it till you're retired, that income, it's a good idea to use a salary sacrifice scheme to do that, because effectively you're lowering your salary, your quoted salary, so by paying more into your pension, and therefore you don't pay as much tax now. So it's quite a useful thing to do if you're somebody who's approaching a threshold and you don't want to pay more tax now. Put it into your pension instead. Again, if you get bonuses and things like that and you don't need the money now, great, you can put bonuses into your pension. And you can, there's something called the annual allowance, which is either £40,000 or up to your maximum earnings, whichever is lower. And if you've got spare annual allowance and you do get a chunk of cash, then the impact of tax relief on that money can be significant uplift. And I'd argue that, given relatively high inflation, and still relatively low rates of interest on savings, although they have been going up, it's still not enough to really counteract inflation. The tax relief on a pension is perhaps the best boost to investment growth over the long term that you can really get from any product at the moment. So just think of a pension like that, basically, a way to give your money an instant uplift if you're saving for the long term.
Okay, wow, some really good stuff there. So make sure you're taking the appropriate risk according to your age, and if you're younger, you should really be considering taking a bit more risk, because really this is to do with the volatility of prices as well, and over time that volatility tends to get ironed out and markets tend to go up. Making sure that you're maximizing your contributions, because employers can often be very generous with this. Know your tax relief as well, and potentially using salary sacrifice if you're approaching your limits, and then any bonuses as well. It's always not a bad thing to put that into your pension, because it is so generous. I mean, the government is really helping you achieve those goals. So it's something you really have to maximise.
It's free money. I mean, it's not free in the sense that you will pay tax on the income that you take from your pension when you retire, and I think that is worth thinking about, particularly if you're also thinking about ISAs, and why not invest in an ISA instead of a pension. ISAs, when you take money out of them, are free of income tax, but pensions, you do have to pay income tax at your marginal rate. So, but for most people, they'll pay less tax because they'll have less income when they retire than now. So it should balance out in your favour to put more into your pension when you're working and earning more.
Okay, brilliant. And Are there people at work who can assist you with some of this information, or is it a case of having to go to a financial advisor?
More employers seem to be offering guidance and education to employees on their pension, which is brilliant, and it is necessary, because with auto enrolment is great. We have to say that is great, but a degree of hand-holding is necessary, and has been, I think, mostly absent, honestly, because it sort of falls between two stools, really. It's provided by HR, administered by payroll, but this and then the provided by an asset manager or a pension consultant behind the scenes. But there's no kind of person in the middle saying what you should be doing. Yes, you should max out your contributions. This is what net pay means. I think more employers are offering solutions, and if your employer does offer a course on understanding your pension, managing your pension, then do go on it. I mean, I know that now these things like lunch and learns take place, where you can listen to somebody from the pension company talking about what your money is invested in, and how risk is managed. But also, speak to HR. There should be a point of contact in your HR department who can answer some basic questions about the structure of the company pension, how to increase your contributions, how to put a bonus payment into your pension. Also, some schemes don't add higher rate tax relief on for you, relief at source schemes. So basic rate tax relief will be added automatically. But if you're a higher rate taxpayer, whether your higher rate relief is added automatically depends on what type of scheme you're in. So actually, you really need to know that if you're a higher rate taxpayer, because if it's not added for you, you'll need to claim that tax relief in a self-assessment tax return at the end of the year. So there's a piece of admin there that if you don't do, you miss out on a huge chunk of tax relief. And actually, people do miss out on that because they don't know, because they've not been told by their employer, or if they have, it's been in some document in a very difficult to find place and they haven't necessarily understood the implications of it. So from that point of view, it's really important. So yeah, a contact in HR, a contact in payroll, to help you understand your pay slip and what's going towards your pension. And they should be able to provide you with the contact details of whoever the pension provider is. And it's usually, it could be a company you've never heard of, and it won't be necessarily administered by your employer unless you're in a private sector defined benefit scheme or a public sector defined benefit scheme. And I mean, look out for education initiatives within the workplace on your pension. And if your employer doesn't provide them, then maybe suggest that you'd be really interested if they did. Because that might inspire them to offer them to all employees.
Okay, interesting. Thanks very much for that. So shall we finish off? We're just going to gaze into the crystal ball, and we're sort of running down the clock a little bit. So I'm just going to ask you a single question about this because it is conjecture. What do we think is going to come up in the spring statement? Are pensions going to be targeted? Are they under the cosh?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, the pensions industry says this every single year because it makes logical sense that a chancellor would target pensions. They have done in the past, to huge detriment, honestly, in terms of our pension savings. So, and it makes sense because unless you're retired or very close to retirement, you're not really that bothered about pension benefits. You have to be quite engaged to really be cross about the Chancellor changing something to do with tax relief if you're early on in working life. So it's a bit of a gift to the Chancellor potentially, because people aren't going to get really, really cross necessarily if the Chancellor cuts tax relief a bit for higher rate taxpayers or additional rate taxpayers. The difficulty is it's already incredibly complex, and it's difficult to make changes to pension and tax treatment without negatively impacting a bunch of people who are really engaged and who are voters, and you don't want to upset your electorate too much, the older voters I'm talking about. So it will be interesting to see what the Chancellor does. I can't imagine him not touching pensions at all. And I would imagine that there would be some give and take. So if there is a change to pension tax relief, and this is mooted almost every year, and that could look like an equalisation between basic rate relief and higher rate relief. So instead of having basic rate tax relief at 20% and higher rate relief at 40%, you would have 30% relief for everybody, which would take away to some degree from higher rate taxpayers, but it would, arguably provide more of an incentive for basic rate taxpayers to pay more into their pension because they're getting 30% relief, instead of paying 20% tax, which is, once you understand it, really significant potential giveaway. But it's not clear really whether the Treasury would generate that much revenue from that kind of move. There are other things they could potentially do to pensions that would generate more revenue. But I think if they were to do that, they'd also have to do things like look at changing the auto-enrolment rules to bring in younger workers and lower income workers into the system. So, you know, there are some clear arguments that 18 to 22-year-olds should be allowed to be auto-enrolled. Currently, if you're 18 to 22, you don't get auto-enrolled into a workplace scheme. You're given the option to join, but it doesn't happen automatically. And you know, if you're on an apprenticeship or you're not going to university or something, that's 4 years potential contributions wasted potentially. So that's something positive that the government could look at. There is suggestions that one way to get the over 50s, that massive group of individuals, I don't know why we call it the over 50s incidentally, that's a really, really big group of people, back into work, would be to make more generous the lifetime allowance and the annual allowance for pensions. I'd expect some changes to the annual allowance because there is this big problem of doctors and higher paid consultants in the NHS leaving work because the annual allowance rules are penalising them. They actually kind of make it nonsensical for them to work. So that's an area that needs to be looked at, and I think will be addressed. Other than that, I can't see any major restrictions happening. We obviously know that there is the state pension entitlement age review, which is due to be published. The government's now saying by May. It was originally January, and then it was going to be before the spring statement, and now it's before May. I expect that the increase in the entitlement age to 68 will be brought forwards. I don't know if it's going to be brought forward dramatically because there will be quite a backlash against that.
Of doing this in 2035, wasn't it? And in order to raise that age?
I mean, originally it's going to take place between 2044 and 2046. And the proposal that is, being considered is should that be brought forward to 2035? That is quite soon, really. In pension terms, 12 years' time is quite soon. So I don't know if I'd expect it to be brought forward that much, but maybe to 2040. Despite the fact that people aren't living longer, and in some parts of the country, seeing reductions in life expectancy. So it is quite controversial, but it's the obvious way to reduce spend on the state pension for the government, which I think is the biggest thing they feel they need to look at.
Okay, well, thank you. So interesting. I'd like to thank my guest, Becky O'Connor.
Thank you.